suing the federal government about your taxes.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is it fair to ask the American people to pay for that?
Well, anything I win, I'm going to give 100% to charity.
But that still takes it from the American people.
No, because they give money to charity anyway. They give away $40 billion a year to charity, our government. Our government gives away $40 billion plus a year to charity. So anything I win from that, but when they go and release your tax returns, which is totally illegal, people go to jail for that, and they've already found...
Today's episode begins with a February 6, 2026 press gaggle on Air Force One, in which Donald Trump discusses the lawsuit he has filed against the Internal Revenue Service. It's unclear what exactly he meant by saying that the United States gives $40 billion a year to charity, but listeners, I'll leave it up to you to figure that out. This is the Tabloid Politics edition of the Political Junkie Substack, and I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil Young.
And Neil, I have been so many places since I last saw you, but why don't you tell our listeners what you've been up to?
Well, I have been busy writing the book that I think I mentioned last week. That's going to be mostly what I talk about probably for the next year. We're also wrapping up our time in Florida. We're heading back to Los Angeles tomorrow. So fingers crossed for, none of the airport drama we've been seeing everywhere, although it seems to be that story is already gone away, except for like one or two airports. But hoping Orlando Airport tomorrow is a breeze.
Well, my guess is it will be, Neil. I was in Colorado this week. I feel like I'm having some sort of time-space vertigo thing happening. But I took your advice and went to a college campus. Listeners, you may remember that a few weeks ago, Neil said everyone should go to a college campus to cheer themselves up. You were absolutely right. I was invited to the University of Colorado at Boulder, which is just a
great campus to go to.
Oh my God.
Beautiful.
And just a beautiful place. And it was so nice to be near the mountains again, like real mountains, not like we have here in Massachusetts, which are basically hills, but real Rocky Mountains where when the sun goes down, it just goes pitch black, which is very cool. But I really loved meeting the students. The faculty were incredibly generous and welcoming, and everybody took care of me. The campus works so well, like everything worked. Even logging onto the guest Wi-Fi worked.
Whoa, that's remarkable.
Yeah, but it was also just inspiring to hang out with the students, and I was invited by the Center for Humanities there. And one of the things I noticed is all the students who showed up, obviously they were humanities students, but they were double majoring in like engineering and English or economics and history. And it seems like today's young people may not be as lost to the humanities as everybody says they are. I just thought, here are kids saying, all right, I need one major that points me toward a well-remunerated career, and I need another major that is fun and helps me think and makes me a human being.
That's beautiful. I love to hear that. I do wonder if it's sort of being shaped by a lot of the career conversations around technology and AI that those who are best suited for it are actually those who are steeped in the humanities. So if even there is sort of a professional agenda at work, but who cares? Let's just have them in those classrooms because, I think we all feel like, the country and the world does better when more people study things like history and English and sociology and, the fields we care about.
Totally. And, it also made me think that maybe we're getting a little distracted by this whole idea of the major because it seems like humanities enrollments are actually quite good.
Yeah.
Why do we think people need to major in the humanities to actually have a robust humanities education?
Well, that's a great point. And I mean, we could probably do a whole segment about this, but I do think that there might be, a real reason for universities to rethink how they track this stuff, how they budget for it, that like, you know, because I know so much has been tied to like how many majors you have and figuring, you know, budgeting and staffing around that. But it seems to me what matters most is how many of your classrooms are full and what's the demand for those courses.
Yeah, and also maybe rethinking disciplines and tenure and so on. Like, why not put a literature person in engineering? Why not put a history person in the chemistry department? You know, it sort of spread us around a little bit and make us more visible to students than maybe we are when we're in departments.
Yeah, and I think we have some models for that. You know, law schools have been good historically for hiring historians, for hiring literature professors, sociologists, and on. And that might serve as a sort of model for how we break out of sort of disciplinary silos when it comes to thinking about how knowledge is structured in a place like a university. Yeah.
Hard agree. And just everybody was so nice. I just want to give a shout out to Jennifer Ho, who is the director of the Center for Humanities there. She's somebody I actually met when we were both bloggers. So we met each other online and knew each other for years online before we met in person. But I also got to have dinner with a bunch of great people, one of whom is our colleague Honor Sachs, who has been famous since the pandemic for a kick-ass TikTok channel. Honor is thinking about doing a podcast, and I told her to give us a call and have a chat, but I think Honor would be a great podcaster. So, Neil, let's talk about the news this week. You know, there's so much news, and I had such a great chance to catch up in the airports. Late last week, Judge Paul L. Friedman of the Federal District Court in Washington issued a scathing ruling that condemned the Trump administration's attempt to control the news. In a case filed by the New York Times, the court invalidated restrictions on reporting at the Pentagon imposed last year by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. What was the impact of Hegseth's new rules for the Pentagon, and how does this really sort of flip that, Neil?
Well, it was quite substantial because, basically, Pete Hegseth said, you know, you can only cover us if you give good coverage of us, and we have to sign off on the things you say about us, which of course is not what reporting at all is. And the outcome of that was that all these major outlets, you know, all the major news divisions, including conservative ones, Fox News, Newsmax, Washington Examiner, Daily Caller, they all withdrew from Pentagon coverage at the time. So I think that was really an important response from a broad spectrum of news outlets, but of course that meant, you know, it created a vacuum that was filled by MAGA influencers like Laura Loomer, Mike Lindell, Matt Gaetz, the sort of folks who are more than willing to go along with what Hegseth wanted. So this ruling from the Federal District Court makes press credentials contingent on reporters agreeing not to solicit information that the Pentagon press office has not cleared for release. And so I kind of wonder about this because it does seem like a big rebuke to the Trump administration. But does that particular aspect of the ruling, does it in some way accommodate what the Trump administration wants here in terms of controlling how reporting happens about the Defense Department?
Well, I think it certainly has a chilling effect. And I think the perpetual attacks on the press, some of which we're going to be talking about in our news focus today, mean that, you know, every outlet has to have a squad of lawyers available to them to fight off these attacks. I think there are a couple of things that are really interesting. One is that Fox News, Newsmax, the Washington Examiner, the Daily Caller, that they went with the mainstream press and by doing that declared themselves mainstream. And I thought that was interesting because I remember a podcast that I listened to about Fox News in which a range of people said, I knew when I went to Fox News that I had to do what they wanted and I had to succeed there because once I was at Fox News, I would never get another job. And I think that's a real issue in the media right now, that people who are going to work for some of these right-wing outlets want to have a little more flexibility. I mean, we really have, we've seen in the past 50, 60, 70 years that, people who started with the National Review ended up at the New York Times.
Yeah.
People like David Brooks and so on. So conservatives want as much job mobility as everyone else. And I think a lot of these outlets did not want to be seen as working at the behest of the Trump administration, which makes me think that they're preparing for a post-Trump future as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, so our second news item today is on Monday, we saw a new front opening in both the redistricting and the election security wars when Riverside County Sheriff Chad Bianco, a Republican, seized more than 650,000 votes that were cast in California's Prop 50 special election. Neil, can you remind our listeners what Prop 50 is, and then tell us why Bianco seized those votes?
Well, Prop 50 we talked about it a good bit. A couple of months ago was this redistricting ballot initiative in California and the election in the fall. Governor Newsom was also often saying that this was California's response to what Texas was doing,
right.
that he was going to play hardball as well. And this basically turned, I think, every California district into a safely Democratic one. It was overwhelmingly supported by California voters. This passed by more than 3 million votes. And so I think those numbers are significant when, Bianco is seizing 650,000 votes of them. I mean, that's barely a drop in this bucket. Right. Bianco is doing this because he claims that the final tally, final vote tally, did not match the number of ballots cast. Now, right. Everyone who's looked at this, including both Republican and Democrat officials, say that charge is baseless. And it has to do with sort of how counting is done. And you can read about sort of the mechanics of all that, but it seems pretty clear that, Bianco here is just is doing something really baseless. But it's also important to know that Bianco is running for governor of California, or at least for the Republican nomination. And I think this is just so clearly a stunt on his part, because it seems a stunt to grab attention, to grab headlines, and I think also to grab an endorsement from Trump, because of course this is a move that Trump himself has done.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And, this whole thing about ballots cast versus final tally, I mean, I haven't actually looked at the numbers myself, but for those of us who are old enough to remember the 2000 election and the so-called hanging chads, there are a range of votes that are invalidated when votes are counted, either because they haven't been cast properly, or they've been corrupted in some way, or they've come in too late, or something like that. So it's a fairly feeble reason to seize ballots, unless you're willing to say, here's where I see the corruption happening. I agree with you. I think it is designed to draw Trump's attention. But does Bianco really have any chance to be governor of California?
No, not at all. I mean, no Republican really does. Although I think, things might be a little closer in some ways in a gubernatorial race in the state of California than they were a couple of years ago. But Bianco is not the one, I think, here to really, change history. And I think the Democratic candidate will be fine. But I do think there's a lot to be said about becoming a Republican nominee in a state like California. Obviously, there will be huge media attention to that, especially from conservative media organizations. So there's a lot to be gained by, becoming the nominee. But I think, again, this just feels in keeping with a pretty consistent strategy from so many Republican candidates, which is to do these stunts that are sort of approximations or variations of things that Trump himself has done before, and to see where how that benefits them as well.
Right. Well, and it also seems to me that one of the effects this has is to sort of continually sow doubt as to whether elections
Absolutely.
can be trusted, so that every single challenge to an election, no matter how stupid, no matter how fruitless, sort of builds the Republican narrative that they are out to get us. Yeah. So Neil, let's turn to your other state, Florida, which seems to be the state that keeps on giving, at least to Democrats. This week, first-time candidate Emily Gregory prevailed in a special election in House District 87. That's Palm Beach County. And Gregory, a small business owner and military spouse, won by 800 votes in a district that the previous Republican won by 19 points. And the beautiful irony of all of this is that she will now represent President Donald Trump in the Florida legislature. What else is going on in Florida this week, Neil?
Yeah, we love to see it. Also, I just want to add to that, Trump voted by mail in this election, which is something he continues to rail against as some sort of like corrupt activity that shouldn't happen. So other things happening. West Tampa's State District 14. Another first-time candidate there, person named Brian Nathan. He's a union organizer, electrician, a Navy veteran. He upset the sitting Republican state representative, Josie Tomcal. This vote was, or rather this victory was by a margin of 408 votes in a district where he previously won that seat by 10 points. So these are, what I would characterize as safely Republican districts that are being won, at least in these two examples, by Democrats, based on a couple of hundred votes. So I think that one takeaway from this is like, for all of us to recognize how much every vote really matters right now, and that it can really matter in a lot of places more than it might have even in recent years. So that's really, I think, significant. I mean, we keep talking about Florida, and I think there's been so many interesting things happening, mostly a string of Democratic victories. All of that, I think, is a good sign. Whether that tallies up to Democrats, Floridians voting for a Democrat for governor, and next time that's up, I'm not so sure. But I think that these are signs that should certainly trouble the Republican Party. One other piece of information from Florida is this District Florida 19. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what's happening there, Claire?
Yeah, one of our favorite MAGAs, former North Carolina Congressman Madison Cawthorn, after he left Washington in disgrace, and by disgrace I mean that he lost his election, but he was also sort of beginning to be investigated for a range of things he had done, including there were pictures online of him apparently having sex with a man, which nothing wrong with that from our perspective, but Republicans didn't love it. But also there seemed to be a lot of stuff running around about his sexual activities with women as well, and, showing pictures on the House floor of naked women. Well, he had to leave with his tail between his legs, as it were, and he moved to Cape Coral. And so he is running from Cape Coral. And there's another guy who's a former congressman from somewhere who is now running in Florida, too. So Florida seems to be the place you go to be rehabilitated as a MAGA. This is Byron Donald's seat. Byron Donald is running for governor of Florida right now. Now, according to the Cook Political Report, it is an R+14 district.
Yes, Gulf Coast. One of those, areas of Florida that's just growing and growing and growing with all the relocation and all the rest. But a very MAGA district, I think, in recent years.
Right. Very, very red. And so we've got, sort of like a jumble of people running, but one of them is Madison Cawthorn. And when he declared, he was at 4% or something like that, but there's so many of them and the polling is so inaccurate at this point. The primary is scheduled for August 18th. Neil, do you think he can do it?
I think of all the sort of races in Florida, this might be a safe Republican district still,
Yep.
And one that Cawthorn actually probably stands to do well in. I mean, there's a lot of places Cawthorn could move to where like his rehabilitation wouldn't happen. Rehabilitation, of course, we mean here is not that he is actually a changed person, but just that he gets to like return to office because no one's holding the past against him. So rehab is probably not the right word for it, but like Florida 19, Cape Coral probably is a place where he can go and, you know, MAGA out and still win. I kind of want to come back to the Palm Beach County result again, because I just love, first of all, that a woman, right, a Democratic woman is who will be representing President Trump. But also, you know, this ties into some other conversations we had. I think it was just a week or two about, was it the mayoral race in Boca Raton, Florida?
Yep.
And, you know, my comment about sort of the surprise that South Florida, given how much South Florida has had an enormous influx of people from the Northeast, you know, in the post-COVID years, and that, again, those, I think I said, you know, those people maybe are not registered Republicans, but a lot of them are. And a lot of them, I think, are the sort of quote-unquote independents who've been voting a Republican more recently. And so for Palm Beach County, for Miami-Dade County, for Boca Raton and Miami to be voting Democrats one after another, as we've seen in these last handful of elections, I think that is quite significant, and it upends what had been a pretty stable, consistent consensus for the last couple of years that like all of this transformation of Florida was actually only going to make it redder. That doesn't appear to be the case.
Yeah, and you know, something else you said last week, Neil, really strikes me as important in Gregory having this victory, which is she just refused to engage all of the culture war stuff.
Yeah.
And she went hard after the real estate stuff, particularly the difficulty that Floridians are having getting insured, and the ways that the state has not done and has not defended itself sufficiently from the climate in order to be able to say to insurance companies, we're doing our best to protect you. So Gregory really went hard at that, and I think people really responded. And I remember last week you said all these new people who came to Florida bought at the top of the market, and now they're flailing.
Yep.
I know a lot of people in Florida who don't have insurance at all on their homes. They're just self-insuring because it's costing like $100,000 a year, and they just put it in the bank to repair after the next hurricane. But Neil, I think we're seeing another pattern here that goes beyond Florida, which is we're beginning to see a pattern of successful Democratic candidates flipping seats when they run as moms. Brian Nathan, he's a union organizer and he's a veteran. And so we're beginning to see an archetype, I think, in some of these new candidates of professionals and union people and veterans saying, this is what it really looks like to care about Americans.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen lots of veterans recruited to run as Democrats in the last couple of years. Of course, you know, I think there's a long history of that already, but there's a certain visibility around the number of them that are doing so right now. And I think there's a lot of like, and this is just sort of echoing what you just said, but like, I'm a real person that's on the ground facing the same things you are, and sort of it's a politics of relatability and a politics of like it's a pocketbook politics of like, this is what, you know, the Trump administration is doing to your bottom line, to your household budget, all the rest, and a real disengagement with the culture wars. And I think it's smart for Democrats to not sort of take the bait of that, because that's clearly something that Republicans want to go to over and over again.
Yeah. You know, I also saw on Instagram that 2 Democratic members of the state legislature in North Carolina who voted for the anti-trans bill, they were defeated.
They were, yeah.
So there's something happening among Democrats, too, around who they do and do not want to be represented by in their own party. So we're going to keep tracking this, but there's one candidate that I wanted to throw in at the end because she is running against our favorite Senator, Lindsey Graham. And her name is Annie Andrews Graham, who is a 4-term incumbent who beat his last challenger by 10 points. The last Democrat to represent South Carolina was Fritz Hollings, who was defeated by Jim DeMint in 2004. Andrews just released a new ad on Instagram that points to how Democrats are positioning candidates to run against Donald Trump's allies. Neil, did you watch the video?
I did. I think the sound of the leaf blower in the background is actually appropriate because there's a lot of sexual innuendo that's going on in this ad. I have really mixed feelings about it.
I know, so do I. All right, so listeners, this is the ad.
We've all heard the rumors about Lindsey Graham, the whispers that circulate around Washington, D.C. and South Carolina, that he is a secret, a part of him that he wants to keep hidden. And then after all these years, he just comes out and says it.
The Iranian regime is on its knees. We're going to blow the hell out of these people.
Lindsey Graham is deeply and passionately in love with war.
Okay, Neil, you tell me about your mixed feelings.
Well, on one hand, I've really enjoyed Annie Andrews. I think she's a really smart politician running really, really good social media game.
Yep.
This one, though, I mean, it's pretty much like, I mean, gay baiting is not the right word. What's the word I'm looking for? I mean, it's basically accusing... Homophobic. Thank you. What's that word again? Yeah, I think if a Republican were doing anything like this, everyone would be up in arms about it. I mean, you just listen to it, listeners. I mean, you heard it. I really was disappointed to see this, I have to say. I mean, I love to make fun of Lindsey Graham, and we'll do that, you know, for the foreseeable future. But it's another thing for a person who's running for office to put this into an ad, and particularly to do so in a place like South Carolina, where I think, you know, it's like it's calculating that it can use homophobia to its advantage, and that's really disturbing. I get it that, like, there's a million reasons to go after Lindsey Graham, for just the absolute hypocrite he is, and for the complete sycophant he has been to Trump and to the Trump administration. Also his betrayal to the you know, the needs of working South Carolinians. But I just thought this was like a bit beyond the pale, and certainly something below the standards of someone like Annie Andrews, who I think is like much smarter and a better person than this.
Yes, it was definitely hitting below the belt. Haha. But I would also say that there's a hint here about where Democrats may be going. And I agree with you. It's homophobic. It relies on a kind of tee-hee-hee locker room humor that always makes me feel a little sorry for Lindsey Graham. I don't know why. Even though he's a ridiculous human being, he's devoted his life to public service. What I resent most about him is he seems to have no principles whatsoever. But I do not resent it that he has not come out as a proud gay man, because actually I think that's an option that should be available to everybody who wants it, particularly people in public life. But I do think there's something else that we're seeing here, which is and we saw this in the Florida races as well, this sense of like, your incumbent is spending all of his time dancing to the drum of Donald Trump and not paying attention to you. And I care about you, and I care about the issues that are actually facing the people in this state. And I think it's a really important point to be making. And I think we're going to be seeing it in House races and Senate races all over the country, because Republicans have basically stopped talking about policy at all. And if in response, Democrats can talk about policy that reaches out to people in language that they can understand and that speaks to their real lives, I think they can win on it. And this idea of like the Republican Party has turned itself over to Donald Trump. And meanwhile, what has happened to you in South Carolina? So, Neil, let's turn to our news focus today and the sort of central question of it, which is, why is the age of Trump characterized by lawsuits? And what was our big flashy tabloid story this week, Neil?
I mean, hard to pick, but this is a pretty good one. It has to do with Erica Kirk, right? Turning Point USA,
Yep.
CEO, well-known widow of Charlie Kirk. She's just pissed off, and as you've said, she's had it up to her waterproof mascara with accusations that she arranged the murder of her late husband. And so anyway, she's been pursuing this by having her attorneys send a cease and desist order to Colin Scott Campbell, and he is this guy out of Maryland. He's behind this thing called Project Constitution. He has also alleged that Kirk was involved in procuring underage girls for Jeffrey Epstein, and also that Turning Point USA is in the business of, or at least was in the business of trafficking orphans from Romania. So some really ugly stuff. There's other people who are getting these cease and desist orders, influencers Candace Owen, Zach De Gregorio. All three say that, the views that they are expressing are merely their opinions, and that they're exercising their right to free speech. But Claire, what else do you think about what's happening here?
Well, of course, the MAGA sphere seems to be standing with Erica Kirk, which is not surprising.
Yeah.
I mean, of this whole crew, she is probably the most respectable one. And it is also probably not surprising that the MAGA sphere has turned on Candace Owens, who is the most prominent of Erica Kirk's accusers, but also she's black. And, we talked about this in an earlier episode, that Candace Owens is, on the one hand, a purveyor of endless conspiracy theories. And on the other hand, it seems that regardless of where she turns, whether it's in liberal circles, which is where she grew up, or conservative circles, where she is now, people really love to hate on her. Now, what she's saying about Erica Kirk is really horrible. And it's really horrible to accuse someone of having their husband murdered on lack of evidence. But I think there are two things that are really interesting about this. One is that Erica Kirk, unlike a great many other people who have been implicated in conspiracies by the far right of the MAGA movement, seems to be wanting to do something about it. And she's basically saying that these somewhat lesser characters in the MAGA sphere, that she is poised to ruin them. And let me just say, listeners, a cease and desist is not the same as a lawsuit.
Right.
A cease and desist says, if you don't cease and desist, I am reserving the right to file a lawsuit against you, right? So it's a kind of fair warning thing, and it's a legal move that usually precedes the expense and difficulty of a lawsuit. But what's also interesting to me about this is how the lawsuit itself has brought this turmoil in MAGA to the front page. It was also interesting to me, Neil, and I mentioned this when I sent you the story, that this story has not appeared in the New York Times, but it has appeared in the Hollywood Reporter.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
I mean, well, I'm curious what you think about that, but I think on one hand, there's a tawdriness to this that maybe the New York Times just doesn't want to touch. This is, in a lot of ways, a media story, so not surprising. Hollywood Reporter, they've actually been doing a lot of good reporting around this issue, and really just the sort of expansion of the conservative media sphere. I think that, the cease and desist part of this is really interesting, because I think that this is going to kind of get into some of the things we want to talk about in this bigger issue for this week's topic of both what is sort of like legal strategy and also what is sort of like political strategy here, and particularly strategy when so many of the people that we're talking about are media figures, because I think there's, in one way, the cease and desist is an effective strategy to get people to shut up, that you want to have shut up. But when those people you want to shut up are people who already have pretty big microphones and big audiences, they can also, and that are driven by a politics of grievance and also a conspiratorial mindset,
Yep.
they can also take that cease and desist letter and use it to inflame their audience and give themselves even more sort of righteous charge. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, when we're talking about the type of folks we're talking about here.
Yeah, and of course, everybody can use it to raise money, particularly these lesser figures like Candace Owens. Zach DeGregorio, I'd never heard of in my life, nor had I heard of Colin Scott Campbell. So in some ways, by recognizing them with a lawsuit, Erica Kirk has now brought them to our attention,
yes.
and we are now bringing it to our listeners' attention, who have also probably never heard of these people.
Yeah, and I think one more point to say here. I mean, think about what it means to ask for a cease and desist in a political movement that has made the calls of free speech, and I'm using my quotation marks there, one of their biggest issues. Now, we've talked at length about how the politics of free speech is like is baloney and malarkey on the right, but nevertheless, it is a galvanizing idea for so many of these folks. So then to be told, I'm being told to shut up and to stop. No, I will not. I'm a warrior for the truth, and I will not be held back by these powerful figures that want to repress me and suppress me and also you, my audience. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot at work in these lawsuits and the way that folks are wielding them in different ways for their own particular advantage that may have nothing to do with a courtroom.
Right. And I think this whole thing about invoking opinion, this is my opinion. And, it reminded me a great deal, Neil, of our days in the college classroom in which you have some kind of troublemaker in the room who wants a lot of attention, who keeps asking questions that, betray a lack of knowledge or true hostility to what you're actually lecturing about. And if you call them on it, they say, well, this is my opinion. I'm allowed to express my opinion, aren't I? And so this slippage between what you're doing as a broadcaster in terms of broadcasting news or ideas that people think are factual. And then when someone calls you on it, you say, well, I never said that was a fact. It's just my opinion. But in fact, Candace Owens has been openly saying, and the lawsuit, which we have linked to, the lawsuit actually shows instances in which one of these people has definitively said that these things happened.
Right.
So, so this leads us to this sort of bigger context here, which is that lawsuits seem to be a feature, not a bug, of the MAGA movement. There are so many lawsuits against the Trump administration or instigated by the Trump administration that the Lawfare blog has created what it calls a litigation tracker, where it's got all of the cases, and we're going to link to that, listeners, and where they are, how they're going. One of the things you'll see when you look at that is that litigation ties a range of players up in an extremely expensive process. So universities, media outlets, law firms, they've been in court almost nonstop. And it seems like when these institutions fight, they win. But Neil, is this part of a longer history?
Yes. I mean, first of all, this sort of grows perfectly out of Donald Trump and his own life and biography and the way that he has employed always, really, throughout his adult life, employed lawsuits as a strategy. And there's this absolutely fantastic interactive graphic that USA Today put out that we'll link to that has counted over 4,000 lawsuits that are, connected to Donald Trump, either as, lawsuits he's pursued or that have been pursued against him. These are, counting for over 3 decades. And they really range. And, and some of it's sort of not surprising as a person who runs a big corporation. Corporations are involved in lawsuits all the time, both, being sued and suing. And so they sort of run the gamut of like a corporate, workplace, a corporation's types of, legal engagements. But a lot of this is just, driven by the person and personality of Donald Trump himself.
Right, right. No, that is absolutely right. And of course, Trump has always sued people, as you say, but there seem to be a lot more lawsuits in the second term.
Yes.
And, we're going to mention a couple of them, but I don't think this is an exhaustive list. He has sued the Des Moines Register and its legendary pollster Ann Seltzer for fraud because Ann Seltzer's poll saw him losing Iowa. And she turned out to be wrong, but I've never known anybody to sue a pollster.
Pollsters are often wrong.
Right, but when the guy actually won the state, I mean, instead you do a victory dance on her grave or something like that. You don't sue her. And that was initially filed in federal court. It's been kicked back to state court, where everybody thinks, even though Iowa is a very Republican state, everyone thinks it has a much better chance because Iowans sort of stick to their own, and Ann Seltzer is a legend there.
Yes.
So Trump is also seeking $15 billion from the New York Times and 4 of its journalists for calling him a fraud. He is suing the BBC for $10 billion. He is suing the Wall Street Journal for another $10 billion. ABC Disney settled a lawsuit with him for $16 million, as did Paramount CBS, which some Democrats believe was basically a payoff for FCC approval of the Skydance merger. And in January, Trump and his sons also filed a second $10 billion lawsuit a third $10 billion lawsuit against the Internal Revenue Service in compensation for his tax returns being leaked to the New York Times. That was the clip we started the show with. Neil, billions? I mean, who sues people for billions?
Right. I mean, that's the first thing to point out. Just these numbers are astronomical and just ridiculous. But I think it's, in keeping with his just, sense of unreality, but also just a lot of what the strategy here is just like gross intimidation. I also think, again, let's just sort of walk through these. The Des Moines Register, the New York Times, the BBC, the Wall Street Journal, the ABC Disney, Paramount CBS. This, just reinforces something we know about Trump across his long life, and especially as president, his absolute obsession with the media and his preoccupation with how he's talked about and how he's been covered in the media. And that goes back to when he was first, a real estate developer coming up in the world of New York media back in the 80s. But that continues through, what is clearly an act of seeking to intimidate these news sources in terms of how they cover him as president.
Yeah, it also kind of seems like a protection racket, too. And, the CBS suit and the ABC suit were also in the billions when they were filed. But then, he settled for a mere smear $16 million. And of course, 16 million or 32 million, as it were, is a lot of money. That's a lot of money to extract from major corporations in order to allow them to go on functioning. But I would also say, doesn't suing the media also guarantee that you keep that in the news as a story and it sort of crowds other things aside?
Yes, and not only that, I mean, I think the price being paid here is not merely that dollar amount, but a phrase that you used earlier in this episode that we'll probably use a couple more times, the chilling effect. So what is the chilling effect that happens within ABC Disney after they've settled a lawsuit that was billions of dollars against them? They settle it for 16 million. But what are they really settling? Inside, they're settling on a different way of covering this administration, a different a different sort of commitment to the stories they pursue, a different way that they actually characterize the stories that they do pursue. I mean, that's the point of all this. Sure, he might pick up some extra dollars out of this, but he's also seeking to create that chilling effect inside a newsroom where they're hyper conscious of who they're covering, and of course that's antithetical to the work of reporting, but is fundamental to the project of Trump and how he operates in this world, and particularly as president.
Yeah, and it also made me think that part of what Trump is doing is saying to these major news organizations, you are no better than tabloids.
Right.
And we're going to turn to talk about tabloids a little bit. But one of the things I did not send you in the show notes, Neil, but I was thinking about as you were talking, was the role that the National Enquirer played in the 2016 election, particularly putting stories on the front page over and over and over again that implied that Hillary Clinton was sick, and also in the role that they played in the catch and kill of stories about Trump that they would purchase and then just put in a file drawer, right? And so tabloids have been Trump's friend. It is also true that the publisher of the National Enquirer, whose name I cannot recall, David something or other, ended up really sort of in the trash bin of history, and I believe losing his job, and I believe getting sued because of what he did. And he had to sort of come out and say, yes, we did all of these things. And it was interesting to me at the time because I remember in 2016 saying to my niece, who was in law school in Florida, how can they say these things about Hillary Clinton? And she said, well, actually, the National Enquirer has been sued a couple of times, and they are usually pretty scrupulous that what they say is either true or cannot be litigated. And so saying, all right, well, I suppose Hillary Clinton did get sick from time to time. I'm sure she was exhausted from time to time. I remember she fainted once getting into a car. She was campaigning so hard. So that the sort of tabloid quality of this is now, because Trump's filthy little fingers are on it, spreading to encompass everyone, right?
Yes. I mean, I think, it starts at the top, right? And this guy's personal strategy has now become sort of political strategy for this administration and for, I think, sort of larger conservative movement actors. But also, I think we can see other examples of it. I mean, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have had a lot of lawsuits against the British tabloids.
Right.
I think there's some interesting points of comparison. I also think there's some real differences there, but just to sort of go over some of the recent one. I mean, so 2 years ago, 2024, he was awarded $300,000. This was against the Mirror Group over a phone hacking suit. Early last year, he settled a lawsuit against Rupert Murdoch's English tabloid publications in exchange for a full apology. There was no financial settlement there. He's also currently suing the Daily Mail for what he's calling media intrusion. So, I don't know if we should argue that Prince Harry is doing this because Donald Trump has done that. I think from what I can tell, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are no fans of MAGA or this administration, but I do think there's ways we can think about sort of how powerful figures use lawsuits to intimidate, to push back on stories about them.
Right. And, they have the resources and they have the legal talent to do it. I do think one of the comparisons is, first of all, I don't know if you read Prince Harry's memoir, but one of his lifetime traumas was his mother's pain at being so profoundly scrutinized by the tabloids. Now, other people have come out and said, well, it's a slightly more complicated story. She actually encouraged the tabloids as much as she suffered from them. But the fact is that she died being chased by paparazzi, and that there was a complicated system of covering the royal family, that once she stepped outside the charmed circle, she was no longer protected by it. So Harry is sort of on a revenge tour, but it is also true that the tabloids in England are far fiercer than they are in the United States, far more intrusive. And he's not the only English celebrity who sues. That being said, look at the small amounts of money here. I mean, $300,000 would be a nice salary for a couple of years' work, but it's not billions, it's not millions. So it almost seems as if he really is suing for the principle of the thing, not to extort money from major corporations.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he's said over and over again. Of course, that may or may not be true, but it does seem, you're right, in keeping with sort of what the, and with his decision to settle in terms of, in the case with Rupert Murdoch, for a full apology, but no money. Yep. It does seem that like those are decisions, that are based more on principle, and an attempt to draw a sort of firm boundary between him and his family and these news organizations. It feels very different than what Trump is doing.
Right. And now here's a comparison, and let's see if this works for you, Neil. One of the things I started thinking about was the lawsuit against Gawker in 2014 that was financed by Peter Thiel. And the face of the lawsuit was Hulk Hogan, that Gawker had published a sex tape of Hulk Hogan. It had been stolen from Hogan's house. Hogan was suing because his privacy had been invaded, which, I don't care one way or the other about Hulk Hogan, but he actually did become a MAGA figure. We know that Peter Thiel is a MAGA figure. We know that Peter Thiel is a close ally of J.D. Vance and has financed him. And what we know about the Gawker lawsuit is that Thiel was sort of like behind the scenes. Nobody knew for a long time, I think until a Wall Street Journal reporter reported the story, that Thiel had financed this lawsuit on behalf of Hulk Hogan. And Thiel did it with the express purpose of destroying Gawker. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think it brings popular culture back in line a little more with freedom of the press issues.
Yeah, and I mean, Thiel was interested in this because, and financed this, and really had sort of a vendetta here that he was seeking via this lawsuit that Hulk Hogan took forward, because almost a decade before, Gawker had outed Peter Thiel as a gay man in the sort of like 2006, 2007. It's, again, we've talked about Peter Thiel on here. I've written about him in my book because he is this, gay. I mean, at one point, I think he called himself a libertarian. I'm not sure that's really how his politics would be described these days, but certainly a super booster of Trump and of J.D. Vance and of this MAGA moment and movement, and has, was a featured speaker at the 2016 Republican National Convention, and called himself a proud gay man. And so all of those things were, notable and historically significant. And yet there was this a major lawsuit that he pursued, that he financed, for the express purposes of destroying a gossip / pop culture website that had outed him. And I think, in a lot of ways, the Gawker event, I think, sort of was a forerunner of so much of what we're talking about now, and of so much of what has become the story of the Trump era and the sort of MAGA movement of, the intimidation, the destruction of traditional media outlets, and the assault on their sort of practices in all sorts of different ways, but particularly through lawsuits, through legal challenges.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right about that. And my impression, I actually read the Ryan Holiday book about the Gawker lawsuit, and it's fantastic. I'll link to it, listeners. It's a quick read, extremely well written, but it really sort of leans on what Neil is talking about, which is Peter Thiel was not ashamed to be gay. He just didn't think it was anybody else's right to talk about it. And that's actually kind of an interesting concept. I mean, let's pretend that we don't think Peter Thiel is a horrible human being. And I do think he's a horrible human being. I won't speak for you. But do publications have the right to make fun of somebody's, because it wasn't just that they were outing him. They were making fun of him for being gay and not being out.
Right.
Do publications have the right to mock someone relentlessly without consequences?
I mean, do they have the right? Like, there's a First Amendment in this country. You know, is it proper behavior? I don't know. That's for you know, each individual news organization to decide. What does it want to be? What is its tone? What is its focus? What is its contribution to public discourse? That's an individual evaluation, and you know, the marketplace can decide how folks feel about it. But there is a First Amendment that exists, and I mean, I don't think we want to necessarily go down this rabbit hole. But you know, one of the questions I wrestled with a lot in writing my book about gay Republicans is this notion that a lot of them have, or a lot of like right-leaning gay men have, which is this idea of a private life, and that their sexuality is something that like is private and therefore shouldn't be discussed. And I think that like that's a complicated conversation, one that you know, we just sort of touched on a little bit with the Lindsey Graham thing, but this idea that like, I think that there's something about like the Teal response, which now in a lot of ways feels really historically dated, but like, this is my private business. It's nobody else's business. And they shouldn't, you know, they shouldn't be the ones to come out with it. I don't know. They're a news organization. Isn't a news organization in the business of digging up stories and telling them? And some of those are about, you know, financial misdoing. Some of them are about like ecological destruction that corporations are trying to pull off in the middle of the night. And some of them are about, you know, people living, you know, lives that aren't consistent with the public image and the public actions that they take. And it seems like all of those are fundamental to what a news organization does.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. And that is, of course, why Teal could not sue Gawker for defamation. Not just the First Amendment, but because he is gay. There's no defamation if you are, in fact, gay. But going through the Hulk Hogan suit, that was a different kind of lawsuit. That was a civil lawsuit for theft and reproduction of something that they had no right to publish. And so it also evaded, and this is where I think Peter Thiel, being a founding tech bro, is really important. It also evaded Section 230 because Gawker was a digital platform. They couldn't be sued as the publisher for putting up something that was, wrong, but they could be sued for putting up something that was stolen. And they could be sued for facilitating another civil crime, which was the intrusion on Hulk Hogan's privacy. So we see Teal going through Hogan for another purpose entirely. And this is the pattern in the lawsuits that Trump has filed against all of these universities and law firms and so on. And I think, if this isn't too crazy, this is where the whole invention of DEI as a problem, this is where it lies. Because you can't sue people for being liberal. You can't sue people for not liking you, but you can sue people using civil rights law. Now, it hasn't been very successful, but it is, in fact, a legal path toward punishing people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, again, so much of what we're talking about are strategies that are not necessarily successful if success is defined by winning in court. But a lot of this is not about like getting that final like victory in a courtroom as much as what you're able to accomplish just by putting something like this into motion. And a lot is able to be accomplished oftentimes via this strategy.
Right. And also you have a group of lawyers saying to you, look, if we settle for 16 million, we can probably spend 16 million next month fighting this lawsuit. Yeah. And this is going to go on for years. So there is a way in which how civil litigation is normally done plays a big role in Trump being able to extort large amounts of money from people. Now, let's talk about something else that's going on that I haven't seen a whole lot about in the mainstream press, but because I listen to the podcast Inside Trump's Head, I know a little bit about it. I think this is the ultimate tabloid event, which is Melania Trump has threatened to sue journalist Michael Wolff, who has tied her to Jeffrey Epstein for $1 billion. Now, in retaliation, he hit her with something called a SLAPP suit, which some states have these laws and others don't. But a SLAPP law basically says you're not allowed to intimidate people by threatening to sue them. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what Michael Wolff did is he filed this SLAPP suit, said under New York State law, because I'm in New York State, and actually, lady, you seem to live in New York State as well, which is part of what's at issue here. Yep. You can't do this. This is against the law, and I'm suing you. What are the ramifications of that, Neil?
Well, it's a brilliant strategy on Wolff's part for the things that you just said, and also because, especially if it goes to court, it would cause both Donald Trump and Melania to be deposed about their relationship with Epstein. So it is just such a smart move on the part of Wolff. And I also think, like, can we come back to this dollar amount? Because I think it's one thing to try and sue like the New York Times for $15 billion, right? Which is just sort of, again, preposterous, on its face right there. Right. But even more so when you're suing an individual person and that person is a journalist for $1 billion. I mean, what is that about?
Right. Well, I think it's about a couple of things, and I think that's a really important point to raise. One is, by the way, do you ever see Michael Wolff on Instagram? He has a gorgeous house in the Hamptons.
Oh, no. I'll have to start following him.
Part of his charm is this beautiful, beautiful, calm, lovely sort of English country house in the Hamptons.
So not a starving journalist, but again, not someone with $1 billion to his name.
Right. And he's written a bunch of books about Trump. Yeah. He, was really a fixture in the first Trump White House. He would just kind of walk in and sit there and people would come up and talk to him. But he's not associated with a wealthy publication. Right? He's associated with the Daily Beast. So I think the $1 billion matters in part because theoretically, if the Daily Beast were pulled into this, Melania Trump could do a gawker on them. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that could destroy the Daily Beast and a range of journalists whose only job seems to be to make fun of Trump and his family. I think the other thing that's really interesting about it is, who can afford a lawyer, even if you've got the pretty house in the Hamptons, even if you've got a nice salary, people who write books, yes, they make money, but then they don't, you have to live off that money. So I would say $1 billion is something that could get someone to back off. And that's what Melania Trump was trying to do. Again, she did not file a lawsuit. Yeah. She had her lawyer's right to say, we will file a lawsuit if you don't stop saying these things about me. And by the way, the things he is saying about her, which he claims he can document, is that Melania Trump was trafficked to Donald Trump. Yeah. And that that is what the Trumps have been protecting in the Epstein files, is the revelation that Melania Trump was trafficked herself by Epstein to Donald Trump. Okay. This is alleged, okay? Don't sue me for $1 billion. This is the allegation. This is what Michael Wolff is saying. This is not anything that Neil or I know to be true. Do your own research, people. But what's also interesting about it is that Wolff has also turned the entrepreneurial tables on them. Okay, so he's chronicling the progress of this lawsuit on his Substack and his podcast and on the Daily Beast. So he's making money from the Substack and the podcast. But also, when Melania sued him, he put up a GoFundMe and said, I need money to pay my lawyers. And he got $500,000 in like 2 days.
Wow.
And so people who hate Donald Trump are giving Michael Wolff money to finance his lawsuit against Melania Trump.
Well, Claire, maybe we do want a threatening letter from the Trumps if we can use it for our own GoFundMe.
I know. Well, maybe we'll take that up at a future time as a way to fund this podcast. Although, listeners, you can fund us without us getting sued by Melania Trump just by clicking one of the buttons that say take out a paid subscription on our Substack. So, Neil, I want to know what you want to go viral this week.
Well, I want to boost a new news outlet. Speaking of media organizations, like we've been doing a lot today, I want to boost this new news outlet that just launched about a week or two ago. It's called LA Material. It is a digital news outlet that is focused on covering Los Angeles, my home city, a city where I've lived now for 6 years, and I'm really excited about this. It is being brought to us by a couple of veteran news folks, including Julia Turner. Julia is the former editor-in-chief of Slate Magazine, former managing editor of the LA Times, and full disclosure, of a friend of mine when I first started writing for Slate Magazine almost 20 years ago. She edited a bunch of my pieces, and we became friends in New York, and have gotten to be even better friends now, both living in Los Angeles. So full disclosure of that. But I'm so excited about this publication and what it's doing already. In just a week or two, they've done some really fantastic stories about the mayoral race in Los Angeles and some interesting things that are heating up there. But then like really quirky things about like, what is this billboard doing on this particular neighborhood, or how far away are the mountains actually? How many people are allowed or should be able to turn at a left turn light on a red? What Mickey Rourke left behind in this house that he was just recently kicked out of. Also a fascinating story that I just read the other day about a sex trafficking corridor in a pretty affluent neighborhood of Los Angeles. So I think you can get from this just sort of all the different stories that this news outlet is covering that are really sort of rooted in on-the-ground reporting, and that are seeking to make Los Angeles legible on sort of all sorts of different fronts, political, environmental, but also like the cultural and the lived experience of folks living in this big sprawling city. So I'm really enjoying it. They have a newsletter, they have a website, I believe podcast and other, digital media forums are coming in the days ahead. But I would just encourage people to go check out the website, lamaterial.com, maybe click on the newsletter. It is a newsletter that I get and I read from start to finish, which is not what I would say about a lot of the newsletters I subscribe to. So congrats to Julia and the team at LA Material. And, we need more news outlets being founded, especially at this moment in time. And we need more that really focus on particular places and cover them closely.
Neil, I'm so happy to hear about this, and I will subscribe to it too. I do think this could be the next stage of journalism, is the reestablishment of local outlets. There's one in New York called The City, which is really good. It's been around for a while, but it's playing a much more important role now, particularly in the Mamdani administration, of doing close neighborhood reporting on what Mamdani is doing. There's one that I like very much that I contribute to every year called Baltimore Beat, which is a Black digital newspaper that covers all the neighborhoods of Baltimore. And, we all sort of hear about Baltimore and Baltimore's troubles. You read the Baltimore Beat, and it is a wonderful, amazing place full of terrific arts and community activists and so on. And similarly, there's a publication called The Trace that only does gun violence. So, I think this is going to be the trend, is the reestablishment of local journalism where people do really in-depth reporting, because a lot of the big papers just aren't doing that anymore.
Yep.
So, Neil, my thing that I would like to go viral this week is Louis Theroux's documentary, Inside the Manosphere. It was directed by Adrian Choa. It's a 2026 Netflix production, and Louis Theroux used to work for, what's his name? Michael Moore. And that's where he started his filmmaking career. So he does a kind of Michael Moore thing of going to sort of embed himself in the world of the manosphere. He goes and visits all of these podcasts. And the podcasters that he's working with are people I had never heard of or met. But he really digs into this kind of gamified world of right-wing male influencers, a number of whom are sort of on the fringes of Trumpism. And one of the things these guys talk about is like, oh yeah, I went to Mar-a-Lago and I got my picture taken with Barron. Or here's a picture. And apparently Barron is into this thing. And like my mother said to me the other day, why does Barron Trump hate women? And I said, I don't know that he does hate women. She said, oh yes, he's totally involved with the manosphere. Well, this is my 93-year-old mother and she knows this, but Theroux actually goes in and films these people. But what's interesting is they are also filming him at the same time. So while his people are filming these interviews, their people are filming him, and then they're cutting it up into content and kicking it out. So the process of making the film is an interactive one in which Theroux is being trolled and threatened and commented upon by their audiences. We think about this world as political, but these guys are not very sophisticated politically, and what they have to say about masculinity is so rudimentary. And I would say the misogyny and the reactionary politics are completely real, but it's also really all in service of making money. I mean, it's sort of like Trumpism at its most distilled, selling the dream of power and independence and style to boys and men who are insecure and directionless. And I would also say, just to close, there was a part of me, I mean, these men are so vile and they are so horrible about the women that they're with, but none of them had fathers, and maybe Theroux just picked, there's 3 white guys and 1 guy of color, who is mixed race. And maybe he just picked guys that didn't have fathers, but there was a part of it that was really sad, kind of like these men who have never quite grown up, who will always feel insecure, who will always feel like everyone thinks they're not good enough. And you just kind of wonder if they had men who loved them when they were children, would they be doing this?
Yeah, I think that, we should do a whole episode on the manosphere. I think we've sort of touched on it a couple of times in recent weeks, but I think that it's good to remember that what they're selling is a product, and that product is, a particular form of hate, and that doesn't mean that that doesn't have real, consequences, real political consequences, and shapes the world we live in. But one wonders what the shelf life of that particular product is, and also just what's sort of underneath all of this for so many of them. If it's about, I don't know. I think as historians, we always feel a little uncomfortable with doing sort of psychobiography. And yet, I think we also believe that biography matters so much, and that the psychologies of the folks we study, and the formations of those psychologies is incredibly important to sort of making sense of who they are and what they do in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And yes, one doesn't wish to psychologize. On the other hand, when you see something playing out right in front of you, there's one of these influencers who, is telling Theroux about how, he doesn't want Theroux to go into this certain room in his apartment because it's really messy and his girlfriend hasn't cleaned it up yet. And that's really her job. And that's what she likes to do, is she likes to clean up after him and do his laundry and so on. And then the girlfriend sort of wanders in, and Louis Theroux turns to her and says, so he said that you really like doing all the housekeeping and taking care of him. And you can sort of see this look on her face like, what? And you realize, of course, it's all a facade.
It's a show.
It's just a show. And they just have a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship like everybody else. And he doesn't pick up his socks. And yes, she probably does it, but she doesn't do it because she loves it.
Right.
So, and that's the part that just seemed so inexpressibly sad to me.
Pathetic,
that these guys are just empty. Mm-hmm. And that part of what they've learned in the age of Trump is that you can perform a masculinity that you don't actually believe in or have.
And get
So
paid
in-
for it.
And get paid for it. Yes, well, and that's what this whole episode is about, right? Is getting paid for all kinds of things that are not actually good or important or even real.
Or substantive, yeah.
Or substantive. So on that note, Neil, great show, and thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you next week.
See you next week. Take care.
You too. That's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is LFG by Divisioner. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.